time, ladies and gentlemen. Very little time. Jacob has to be going shortly, and I'll now take a few questions. And the great man himself has indicated he'd like to put a question.
Yes, I would indeed. First of all, to say how remarkable these speeches have been, and that in this very hall, where the likes of Cobden and Bright set out the principles for free trade, repeal of the Corn Laws and the democracy for the men and women of this country, to be here today to hear such brilliant speeches from four such distinguished speakers is a remarkable tribute. Could I have another round of applause for them, please? I really only have one question to the panel, and it is simply this. Do you not think it is about time that we asked and indeed obliged the Ramonas and the Reversers to explain why they would want to keep us shackled in a European Union which was both deliberately undemocratic and deliberately protectionist?
Thank you very much indeed, Bill. Gerald Lyons.
Well, thank you, Sir Bill Cash. I'll be very brief because my colleagues here will have far more to say. I think the big challenge is that the image of a post-Brexit Britain is being framed by the Ramonas, and I think they are wrong. From an economic perspective, one of the biggest challenges in economics is a combination of groupthink and status quo bias. Groupthink in economics has proved to be wrong so often before, ahead of the financial crisis, even the euro. Lest we forget, we were told or informed that if we did not join the euro, say for instance the City of London would lose out to Amsterdam, Paris or Frankfurt. Nissan would shut down its Sunderland plant. There's often this fear reinforced by the status quo that people don't want change. But I think we do need to have a positive vision. Many people seized on it in the referendum campaign, and I think, as you've heard today, we need to continue to push that forward.
Jacob, would you like to comment on this?
Yes, I mean, I agree with both the points. We need to put the positive case for Brexit. I think the government has been too Eeyore-ish about it, and it's why I'm so pleased with what Boris is doing, because Boris is supporting government policy and saying it's a jolly good thing, whereas there's been some feeling that the government's doing it because it has to rather than it really wants to. And inevitably that allows the opponents of Brexit to make the running. So this positivity that we're getting at the conference is really encouraging, and we need more of it.
Thank you very much for those comments. I have a question that's been given to me. It reads as follows. We know that the Foreign Office and the Treasury actively campaigned against Brexit during the referendum campaign. Should we be worried that the civil service will try to sabotage the process of withdrawal from the EU? Yeah. Shankar, your thoughts on that?
I'm wondering who was going to get that one. Well, let me first of all say, I think it is human nature, to Bill's question, to ask what the world looks like and ask what's wrong with it. It's very unusual to look at the world and say what's missing, what could it be like. And I think that is the heart of the problem right now. I think there is a great deal of fear, and it's very understandable, from businesses, from government, from everybody, about this great unknown that we are marching out into. And I think in order to march out into the unknown, first of all, you need to know where you're going. So this is why it's very important to understand exactly what the end state looks like, that it is a state where I believe that we will have a good, comprehensive free trade agreement with Europe, but we will also have agreements with other countries. We will be leaders in the WTO, we will be leaders in global standard-setting organizations, and all of that taken together will be a significant gain, not only to our own economy, but to the global economy. And we live in a world of interconnected supply chains, and when the global economy does well, we all do well. And the country that actually is leading this will probably have a disproportionate share of that wealth that is created. So I think part of it is that. And I think part of it is also not really recognizing the economic environment in the world and assuming that we have essentially exhausted all the gains of trade liberalisation that we could have exhausted over the last 70 years of liberalisation since the Second World War. We believe that actually we've barely scratched the surface of this, that the global economy has grown by 200 or 300% since 1945. We are absolutely not in a new normal. There are huge potential gains. And it's not only agricultural trade and the barriers there, but it's also all the distortions and barriers and services and markets all over the world. And I think if we can actually make serious progress on those, and that's why I think Britain as a trade leader is so important, because we're a country that can do this, actually the global gains are of the order of many times bigger than the gains we've seen in the last 70 years. And what does that mean? It means a totally transformed world. It means low budget deficits. It means very low unemployment. It means new industries being created all over the country and all over the world. And absolutely, it is a future that we should be embracing. But I think it's very difficult for people to see all of that, and I think it's up to us to paint that picture.
Thank you. Gentleman on the right, yes. The gentleman behind, yes, you, sir.
There are some indications that the popular vote is moving towards Remain in recent polling. And the problem is we've got a media that is committed to remaining, and particularly the BBC. Only half the story comes across. And there are some ideas like the cliff edge that the CBI invented that people are starting to believe. Well, at the top of the cliff, we've got a 100 billion deficit for 40% of our trade, and at the bottom of this so-called cliff, we've got a surplus with the rest of the world. But we don't seem to get the message across. So why can't we start talking about climbing out of the European ditch into the sunny uplands? Because unless we still have a fight of ideas. The analysis and the speeches was great, but we must get the message across because we haven't got out yet.
Jacob.
I do accept to some extent that after the referendum, Brexiteers thought that they'd won and didn't need to carry on making the argument, which we do need to carry on making vigorously, because the official establishment, the bureaucracy, is very keen to undermine Brexit. And to go back to the earlier question, the behaviour of the Treasury in its short-term economic forecast just before the referendum was deeply disgraceful and dishonest. The Treasury... The Treasury put out a political propaganda document that was wrong under the auspices of its centuries-old reputation, to which it did considerable damage. And I think this is partly a question for Brexiteers, but it's also a question for the government. The government has to be more vigorous in selling government policy. That's what governments normally do, and therefore I would encourage it to do a bit more of that.
Yes, sir.
John Strafford. Chairman, at a meeting of Conservative Party members held this morning, organised by the Bruges Group and the Campaign for Conservative Democracy, an election was held for the position of party chairman. And I'm delighted to tell you that the winner in that election was Jacob Rees Mogg by a mile. I would add that the current party chairman, who is also on the ballot paper, received nil votes. So I would like to say to Jacob Rees Mogg, if offered the post, will you take it?
I'll say something more directly, and that is to say that I will not have a word against Patrick McLaughlin. You will not know that when I appeared before the candidates list in 1998, I think, The MP interviewing me was one Patrick McLaughlin, and without his support I would never have been on the candidates list and I would not be a member of Parliament. So as I owe my political career to him, the requirements of gratitude mean that I support him fully. He is a wonderful man, an incredibly loyal servant of the Conservative Party, and it would be hard to say that he was running the election campaign. So I think it would be unfair to make him a fall guy for mistakes that were made elsewhere.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed all the speeches today. I just want to raise something which seems to me not to be being discussed enough with the Brexit debate, which relates to the sort of Britain we want after Brexit. A lot of people who voted for Brexit voted because they wanted a fairer society. They wanted the NHS to be properly invested in. And I have to say, I would very much strongly like a Britain which supports the welfare state and which is more equal. And I was wondering whether any of you well-informed people saw any possibility of that emerging from Brexit.
Patrick.
Well, that's a very good question, because one of the things that has been completely ignored by the Remain side is the tremendous gain in living standards particularly for lower income people from Brexit. I mentioned the general fall in the CPI and how it was bigger for lower income people. For people on 60% of median income, it's 9.3%. But a significant element also is the labour market. And while I completely agree we have to be totally generous with our EU citizens that are here, in terms of future rules, we have to get rid of the distortion of the labour market that subsidises unskilled wages by 20%, because this has an enormous impact on poor people. We calculate that not only do poorer people have to pay a disproportionate burden for public services that provided to unskilled immigrant in this country, but also their wages are depressed by something like 4% in these poorer communities. This is our estimate. And so when you put all this together, we reckon that the living standard of someone at the bottom end of the income distribution, say 60% of the median, will rise 15% due to Brexit, which is an astonishing number, but it's the result of all these aspects that are tremendously important for poorer people in this country, and that is something that we really need to put across.
Yeah. Shankar.
I think you've raised the central question in this whole thing, which is what kind of country do we want to be? And you can't actually have an independent trade policy until you know who you are and who you are as a country. So I think those issues are very important to raise, and I would second everything that Patrick has said about price and so forth in terms of poorer people. I would like to add one comment, though, about a creation of a fairer society, and Jacob sort of mentioned this when he talked about billions of transactions that are happening around the country. And what he's really talking about is voluntary exchange, people coming together to meet each other's need without distortions by the government, without distortions by big business or crony capitalists, but able to simply succeed or fail on their own merits and their capacity for hard work. And I think this competition-based or aspiration-based society is precisely the kind of society that we want to create in this country. And if we're able to do that, then we want to reduce the distortions in the rest of the world, and we want to allow people in the rest of the world to benefit from the same things that we have in this country. And I would say that, especially what we hear, what we heard last week in Brighton, is an incredibly important concept to get across. There is declining support for what traditionally have been described as free markets and free trade in the world, particularly in developed countries. And I think we're on the edge of a precipice here. We could make a very, very bad mistake in throwing out the very things that have created so much prosperity and lifted so many people out of poverty in the world.
Jared.
Yeah, thank you. Well, this gives me an opportunity to plug my book, if you don't mind. Actually, Liam Halligan and I, in the book Clean Brexit, half of it is about leaving the EU, and the other half is what we think we should do once we've left. And I think one of Britain's biggest exports is its pessimism. We're always far too pessimistic. But the question over here, I think, is very valid about the positive vision. Let me say, I think it's the 4 I's. Incentives. Returning competency from the EU in so many areas allows us to start to get the incentive structure right, helping small and medium-sized firms. Even returning competency in terms of regional policy, that's key. Investment. UK companies have underinvested relative to any international criteria based on the last 20 years. Investment, I think, will start to become more of a positive driver in the economy if our domestic policies are more enabling for the private sector. Innovation. The EU is one of the low innovation regions of the world. The Indo-Pacific, America across to the Asia-Pacific, is driving the 4th industrial revolution. Britain and America are the only 2 countries that have a whole list of universities in that top 50. We have the ability to be one of the innovation leaders, but again, if we do it right. And the final thing is infrastructure. It's hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure, and institutional infrastructure. Hence the question about the Treasury, I think, is very important. In the book, we say that institutional infrastructure needs to change away from the groupthink to status quo bias. But I think the important thing is outside the EU, we have a lot more levers at our own control, and as much as one can be independent in the globalised economy, we are far more independent outside the EU than clearly we would ever be within inside it. Thank you.
Jacob, would you like to comment on this?
Yes. I think you make everybody better off through free markets, and if you look at the amazing decline in poverty across the globe since 1980, since China and India opened up, you've got 1 billion fewer people on $1 a day or less. You've seen the percentage on the absolute poverty line go down from about 50% to about 20% in the last 30-odd years. This is a stunning success for free markets, and I think the same applies domestically. And it's basically, as cake is the main topic of conversation in relation to the European Union, it's Margaret Thatcher's cake. It's that you bake a bigger cake and then everybody can have a bigger slice, rather than trying to cut up the small cake into differing slices. So I think that's the approach, and I think free markets lead to that, and all the evidence is that they lead to that. And what Patrick's saying is so important. Food, clothing and footwear are the 3 highest individual tariffed items in the customs union. Ladies and gentlemen, which section of society spends the highest percentage of its income on food, clothing and footwear? So who do we make better off soonest? So therefore, who is on the side of the poorest, Theresa May or Jeremy Corbyn? You know the answer.
We've all got to go. Well done, Jeff. He was great. Jacob is great. Jacob is great, isn't he? I've never actually, and I have never been very good at watching speeches on telly, but he's really good speakers.
Right.
It made America realise that Britain was her real and true friend when they were hard up against it and wanted something, and that no one else in Europe was. They're a weak lot, some of them in Europe, you know. Weak, feeble.